In 1943, 250,000 Axis prisoners were captured in Tunisia, the northernmost country in Africa. President Franklin D. Roosevelt offered to create more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps in the United States to incarcerate them. Then, on July 8, 1945, tragedy struck at Camp Salina. An American guard named Clarence V. Bertucci machine-gunned 9 German prisoners to death and wounded 20. This was headlined by Time as the Midnight Massacre, the largest killing of enemy prisoners during World War II on U.S. soil, causing debate on if the Geneva Conventions were followed and if the diplomacy was adequate. The Salina Prisoners of War Camp was converted from the old Civilian Conservation Corps camp. At first, Salina locals were tentative about sharing their hometown with the enemy soldiers.
I disliked the Japanese and I disliked the Germans. They were the wickedest people on earth. How could they even stand themselves? So I was in utter disbelief when my father announced that Monday morning a busload of German prisoners of war would come to our farm and work in the fields.
As all work done by prisoners of war were forced labor, work regulations were a major concern of the 1929 Geneva Convention. Considering that most young men in the United States had entered military service, the federal government instituted a program to hire German prisoners for agricultural labor. Upon knowing prisoners of war in person during work, residents gradually warmed up.
My dad would take a 5-gallon can of milk out for him, and my mother would fix some little treats for him. So they were well treated in this prison camp. So they were very friendly. But there was some of the Germans that was really hard-nosed Germans, because some of them wouldn't eat any of the treats or drink any of that milk. They were really strong Germans and believed in Hitler.
Wir waren alles junge Leute, uns war egal. Krieg war aus für uns. Wir haben unser Essen und Trinken, fahrt uns wo ihr wollt, ist egal.
Compared to the unfortunate souls in Nazi concentration camps or in the Bataan Death March, prisoners of war in Salina were treated humanely, abiding by the Geneva Conventions.
Most of the German prisoners who were repatriated 1 and 2 years later went home weighing more than they did when they got into the camp. They were well fed.
Some of the former detainees thanked Salina folks and visited back years later. This humanity influenced Germany's Cold War decision.
One of the men that I interviewed, who was here as a prisoner of war, said that it was clear in his mind after the great treatment that they had had here with food, with clothing, with respect to the Geneva Convention, in contrast to what was going on for the German prisoners in the Soviet Union. It was the difference between night and day. So I think it had a very profound impact, and on into the Cold War.
By then, soldiers unfit for frontline service, including Clarence V. Bertucci, were selected by the Army to guard the prisoners. Rudy Linz, a former prisoner of war, told of a story where the guards would take a snooze and we woke the guards up at the end of the day. As a 6th grade dropout in New Orleans, Bertucci remained a private after 5 years of service due to 2 court-martials and behavioral violations. While he had been overseas in England with an artillery union, he had never seen frontline action. Disappointed at the tour, he said he felt cheated out of his chance to kill Germans. Someday I will get my Germans. I will get my turn. As his motivation, scholars believe that all the war propaganda, screaming, and lies and hatred comes invariably from people who are not fighting.
U.S. guards that were assigned to those camps, because many of them had had experience fighting in Germany and were sent back, and they had a much better understanding of what war was like than Bertucci did.
However, the war hatred had driven the actions of the U.S. soldiers who killed disarmed German troops in the Shinonia Massacre and the Dachau Liberation Reprisal. On July 8, 1945, Private Clarence V. Bertucci had a few drinks, then went to a diner, where he gave his waitress a signed photograph of himself and promised that something exciting will happen tonight. Bertucci then climbed up the guard tower to take his shift and covertly loaded all 250 bullets into the .3 caliber Browning machine gun, aimed and fired 3 rounds across the entire camp. Hundreds of people broke the silence of the night with cries of pain. Bertucci's commander yelled at him to get down, but Bertucci yelled back, "Bring more ammo, I'm not done yet." Eventually, Lieutenant Colonel and Corporal Delirme O'Butts subdued him. Afterward, other camp guards volunteered to execute Bertucci because Bertucci's violence tainted the honor of the guards. The people near the campsite thought that the prisoners were escaping, but soon realized it was quite the opposite. They rushed to aid the wounded German soldiers. Unfortunately, 8 soldiers died that day, and a 9th died a few days later in an army hospital.
Right here, about 300 feet kitty-corner from this guard tower that Mr. Bertucci was in. And we were awakened, my father and I came out on our front porch, and we could hear the shooting and hear the prisoners crying, wanting help and like that. So I was only 6 years old at the time, but the only thing I knew was that we came out on our front porch and we could hear and see what was going on that morning. So.
The victims were buried with full military honors at Fort Douglas Cemetery on July 12th, with no German flags. The 9 deceased German prisoners' families were not informed of their death until a year later. Miss Joseph Paul, the mother of Adolf Paul, had been seeking out her son's news in desperation and distress. No reason or compensation was given, but she was sent a letter of apology, a small paycheck, and a death certificate.
That was the role of the Red Cross. The U.S. Army should have been more proactive informing the families of those who were killed.
That's probably debatable whether that was a provision of the Geneva Convention or not, but I think in the spirit of the convention, that's something that they should have done.
Unlike the trials for the Malmedy Massacre or the Tokyo trials, Bertucci was never held accountable for his actions. To the Army, killing 9 prisoners by an American soldier was a public relations disaster. After the attack, Bertucci was sent to the 9th Service Command headquarters at Fort Douglas. Army officers initially cited his 12 hospitalizations, including some mental examinations, as a reason for insanity. Captain Wayne Owens, the incident investigator, concluded that Bertucci should be court-martialed since the act was calculated. However, his superiors questioned his authority to judge a man's sanity. After weeks of re-evaluations, the doctors at Bushnell Army Hospital finally concluded that Bertucci was mentally unbalanced. He was hospitalized in Mason General Hospital in Brentwood, New York, and released before 1965. He still felt no remorse before he passed away on December 2, 1969. His simple explanation was that he hated Germans, and so he had killed Germans. Some telegrams showed sympathy for Bertucci and the massacre. German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keidel typified Nazi reprisal policies with these words: "This struggle has nothing to do with the soldierly chivalry or the regulations of the Geneva Conventions." But the consequences and bitterness of Bertucci's actions weighed heavily back on the German prisoners of war and their families as well. Herbert Barkoff, a former detainee of the camp who visited Utah, wrote, "The widows and the orphans, the family members, the seriously wounded who never regained their full health, the others who were injured, they carried the burden that was brought during the night of July 9, 1945. As we can tell, the Midnight Massacre left behind many debates about its legacy and controversy. The board language of the Geneva Conventions contained ambiguity and lacked practicality, ranging from the responsibility of the massacre to the questionable approaches that officials to bring justice to the prisoners of war community. Debate and diplomacy throughout the Salina Massacre changed the small community of Salina and the world forever.